My obsession with hell, my own evil, and suffering from random evil thoughts did not truly begin to fade in my life until I began looking into alternate ways of viewing the world. Mostly because of my fear of going to hell, I wanted the idea of hell abolished. And so I began exploring universalism. The first time I came across a universalist webpage called tentmakers.org, I was terrified to see a hideous-looking demon staring at me from my computer screen, but then the creature's voice began getting higher and higher until it sounded like a chipmunk. This site was taking the horrible notion of hell and mocking it. I instantly loved it. I was informed by the site's creator of the many places in the Bible where God declares his love for all and his willingness for none to perish. The logic was crystal clear in my mind. If God is truly willing for all to be saved, and God is all-powerful, then God must certainly save all. For if God had the power to save all, but didn't, then he would not be good. If he wanted to save all, but couldn't, then he wasn't all-powerful. If God does everything according to his will, and his will is for all to be saved, then it logically follows that God will save all. It was like music to my ears. I began to believe that the Protestant version of Christianity I had grown up with portrayed a judgmental, unloving God who would send people to hell for eternity, simply because they had the wrong beliefs about him. I bought it hook, line, and sinker, and felt waves of relief come over me. At this time, I began to believe that perhaps I wasn't totally depraved after all. Maybe, I thought to myself, my belief in total depravity affected my mind to such a degree that I constantly obsessed with my own shortcomings and my own evils. Perhaps sin wasn't a natural state that we were all in, but rather a state that we put ourselves into based upon our beliefs about who we are. I began to think Christianity was a very narrow-minded religion that offered its believers a closed-minded view of the universe and ultimate reality. I thought to myself that if I had been raised as a universalist, I never would have tried to commit suicide because I would never have had those evil thoughts in my head. I wouldn't have believed Satan and his demons were messing with my mind, and so I would have had a much more free mind. In my estimation, it seemed that the belief system you adhered to was what caused you to think destructive thoughts about yourself. Since I was always focused on my sinful nature and how I was never good enough, because Christianity says that I am a sinful man and do not deserve God's goodness, I thought that my malicious evil thoughts and fantasies originated from within the Christian belief system of heaven-hell, and not from within myself. As time went on, my thinking grew more and more secular, and less centered on Christ at all. I just didn't care to hear about him or learn about him, because I associated Christ with all of that pain I went through. I blamed the belief system for my evil imaginings. At this point, I had truly risen above thinking obsessively about evil. Rather, I began to think worldly. I was sick of guilt, and I no longer accepted the view that Christ was the Son of God, nor that Yahweh was God, nor that the Jews were or had ever been God's chosen people. I became a staunch deist. God had done so little for me, I thought. I had prayed so many times for him to relieve me of the evil in my heart, but he never answered my prayers. So maybe God doesn't involve himself in human affairs whatsoever. I thought I had cured the evil within my own heart by rejecting those stupid Christian doctrines and realizing that God was not so judgmental. Maybe God sets the whole thing in motion and just watches it with enjoyment, I thought. I felt I was making incredible leaps and bounds in my understanding of the true nature of reality, with much help from Thomas Paine's Bible-destroying work called The Age of Reason. Again, to me, Paine's writings were like a breath of fresh air and confirmed suspicions I'd held about the Bible, but had never been able to adequately voice. He showed the utter injustice of a God who would command the Jews to kill unarmed Canaanite women and boys and keep the virgin girls to themselves. He pictured God as a petty, vindictive warmonger who played war games with his favorite group, the Jews. In my mind, he decimated the Bible, and after I'd read The Age of Reason, I believed there was barely anything in the Bible worth reading at all. I despised the Bible because it represented to me religious intolerance, killing people because they don't share the same views as you do, an unjust and unloving God, and furthermore, the cause for all of the manic thoughts I had ever had. It was like the more I had read the Bible for comfort, the more comfort had been taken away from me. The problem was, at the time, I had been unconsciously reading the Bible only selectively, taking notice of God's justice and hatred of sin, but completely forgetting his overwhelming love. At this point in my life, I no longer feared dragging God's name through the mud. My fears of hell had already been destroyed. I vehemently argued with many Christians and tried to tear down their belief systems and ridicule their elementary thinking. I went from having spiritual pride to having intellectual pride. I did not fear the wrath of God anymore, because I believed as a deist that God was ultimately loving above all and would understand my lack of belief. If it turned out that Christianity was indeed true, God would understand because he would know I was doing the best I could with what I had been given. I truly believed it to be the truth, that God was just and I did not deserve punishment. I began spending time with people outside the church and began imitating their ways. I never became addicted to anything, although I would occasionally get drunk. The first time I ever had sex was when I was 29 years old, and I thought it high time to experience this thing that so many people in the culture were raving about. I had a girlfriend, and I love her to this day, but she didn't speak much English, mostly Spanish. But she did understand the language of love and was very affectionate. I finally decided to myself that I had waited long enough, and that God might never have a wife for me to marry, and so I didn't want to spend the rest of my life being a virgin. I had always held a deep conviction that sex should be engaged in only within the loving confines of marriage. But as I threw out the Bible and Christ as a guide, I figured I may as well live life the way I wanted to. I don't know how long this period lasted, but I had several moments of clarity through the confusion. A while after I'd had sex, I became aware again of the evil that I had done and the separation that had occurred between me and Christ. I repented to Christ and asked for forgiveness. Somehow I became aware of the intellectual shortcomings of deism and saw the simple beauty in Christ. I cried out to God with my whole soul and begged for forgiveness. I came into a proper relationship with Christ, but it wasn't to last. Shortly after, I traipsed again back into deism and returned to my sinful ways, this time getting drunk and having a small orgy. There was no joy from this, yet there was immediate physical gratification. Over time, I just settled back and decided the pleasure wasn't worth the emotional investment, and I contented myself to be solitary. But just because I wasn't having sex with others doesn't mean I wasn't sinning in my mind by engaging in masturbatory practices while looking at softcore pornography on the internet. I began to realize a trend in myself as time went on. My mind began to flip-flop between deism and Christianity. Both were such an integral part of me. But I noticed that whenever I held onto a love for Christ, I became much more aware of my sin. But now, instead of condemning myself for it and feeling horrible, I repented and turned from it, and I no longer obsessed with my former wrong. I was able to trust that I had been forgiven. When I held onto a deistic worldview, I viewed God as distant, therefore not caring so much if I said "God damn it" out loud or if I engaged in sexual fantasies in my mind. In my heart, I wanted Christianity to be true. I wanted life to have ultimate meaning and purpose. I wanted God to be sovereign and direct human history to a wonderful and glorious conclusion. I wanted to be part of that experience. And indeed, whenever I became a follower of Christ in my heart, the thought always seemed to accompany it that I was sent into the world to prepare the world for his return. I wanted my life to mean something. With deism, I was not certain God would guide my path if I trusted him, because he hadn't really done anything to prove his love to me, other than to create me and create the universe. With Christianity, I became certain that so long as I pursued Christ daily, he would direct my steps. Yet at the same time, I was hesitant to give up deism, because I believed in the back of my mind that deism was central to the cause of my being freed from devastating thoughts of evil acts and self-condemnation. I'll continue this in the next video.